Perfect.
Welcome everyone to the third edition of Tech Tuesday. I'm Sarah Kennedy, the Director of Colorado Hands and Voices. So glad to have you all here. I know some people will be jumping in as we go. Sandy, do you want to introduce your team?
Yes, I am Sandy Gabbard. I'm an audiologist at the Marion Downs Center. I'm also the audiology faculty director for the Leadership Education and Neurodevelopmental Disabilities Training Program at JFK Partners. And we have two of our trainees on now. The disclaimer is they have officially graduated and they are officially audiologists, but they are just wrapping up their training with this little project to share with all of you. So I'm very, very proud of them. They're really out there in the real world at this point, virtually at least, I guess. And so Cassie's going to take the lead today, and Annalise is going to chime in, and I'll let you guys introduce yourselves.
Perfect. Thank you for that introduction, Sandy. My name's Cassie. I'll be giving this presentation, and then Annalise is just going to hop in and introduce herself.
Hi everyone, I'm Annalise and I'm just the fourth year who's finishing up at the Marion Downs Center with CMB.
Thank you, Annalise. So a little bit about our tech talk today. There's gonna be a few components to it. We're gonna do a review of last week and talk about a few different things. So let's go back to last week for those who weren't here. Oops, sorry, technical difficulties with my computer. So a little bit of a recap from May 12th. We talked about how information is transmitted from hearing aids or cochlear implants, and that's through FM, Roger, Bluetooth, or streaming. We talked a little bit about should I upgrade my child's hearing technology and what are the key differences between the new hearing aids on the market and the older hearing aids that we saw previously. A big component now and a big thing with our teenagers and our youngsters is the fact that you can Bluetooth stream directly from your hearing aids, and the fact that your hearing aids can now be binaurally paired. So that's just a little recap of last week. We're going to go into our discussion this week. So the first question I have for all of you was, during your first hearing aid consultation with the audiologist, what types of hearing aids were discussed with you and your family? Do you remember the different types? Do you remember kind of what the key points were? And if it's a long time ago, that's okay as well. So a few different types just to kind of refresh. There are three different types of hearing aids that we commonly talk about. Behind the ear hearing aids, which we typically refer to are for our younger kiddos. There's the base of the hearing aid that's a little bit thicker, and the hook. The base is where all of the technology itself is in. It's the casing to the hearing aid, and then it's usually connected with an ear mold, which is specialty set for each of your kiddos that mirrors the image of their outer ear, so it connects up with the tubing. Another type of hearing aid, which is commonly used in older kids, but which can be used with younger kids, is the receiver and the canal hearing aid. These, where it still has the back body of the aid that goes behind your tongue. It has the wire, and that wire is where all of the technology is kept. And that is why it's a little bit more, I would say, delicate, and that's usually why we choose to go with our older kids for those specific types. Another type of hearing aid is the in-ear device. That's more custom fit, and it's just for those who like to have their device more set in their ear.
Cassie, why don't we let the people on give us a quick update on what kind of technology their kids are using now?
Yes, that would be great.
Would anyone like to share?
Well, I'll jump in. We did behind the ear hearing aids at first with our daughter, and she did have a progressive loss. So she transitioned to a cochlear implant one side with one hearing aid until she was 17. And then at 17, she got the second cochlear implant.
So as my oldest, who's 24 today, started with digital or analog behind the ear aids, then transitioned to digital behind the ear aids, and right now he has the receiver and canal. His aids are about 3 years old, so he hasn't got quite as much of knowledge, but he's been watching his younger brother, who started out with 12 years ago with the behind the ear for the kids, like you see, and we just upgraded to the Phonak, the newer version, the Marvel, which I believe their receiver in canal. He definitely can stream Bluetooth. He's loving that with the remote learning. It's really making it helpful for him to have access, especially because he's a more social kid. So they have like lunch bunch and stuff. So that's really all the experience we've had.
We've had behind the ear hearing aid. My son's unilateral, so he's got a behind the ear hearing aid. Although our audiologist recently mentioned maybe going the route of the bone conduction.
And Katrina, I see you got your hand up.
Captions for me, please.
You know, we did not have captions unless people requested them. So I'm so sorry about that.
Yes.
You know what? I will take as many notes as I can and try to get it to you and your mom after the call.
And we are probably going to be able to have it captioned when it gets up on YouTube.
Oh, great.
Once we have all four, we're going to make them available to everybody, and they should be captioned at that point.
Oh, great. Okay. Katrina, do you want to share what you're using right now?
Yes.
What are you using right now? You have a cochlear
Cochlear.
implant number 6.
6.
And 6.
And 6.
An N6 cochlear implant? Okay.
Thank you for sharing, Katrina, and thank you to everyone
My
else.
left side.
Did anyone else have anything they wanted to share? No? Okay. Perfect. So we're going to move on to the next slide. If your child had any of those previous devices, we talked a little bit about the behind the ear devices and the in the ear devices. Which did they like the most? And do you wish that audiologists had brought up other options to consider when your child got older?
I feel like we weren't really presented many other options other than the behind the ear. And so I was actually a little surprised when at our audiology visit a month ago, our audiologist talked to us about looking at a bone conduction hearing aid. My son's 7 and has been aided since he was 2. So
For us, especially this last time, we talked about the behind the ear receiver in canal and some of the, because Phonak was just coming out like that month, it was in December, I guess, with the new model, whether we wanted to go with that, whether we wanted to stay with Phonak or not, discussed pros and cons. So I felt like we had a pretty good lay of the land for our kiddos' needs. I think our audiologist did a nice job of explaining that. We even talked about the different, because his older brother has the hard plastic ear molds because he doesn't like the domes. He feels like the clarity, he's a musician, and so he feels like the clarity of those hard plastic molds is better for him. But my younger son, is 12, so he's hoping he can play football and sports. We, kept with the softer molds, but it was neat to hear my 12-year-old asking those questions.
Thank you for sharing. That's a good insight to hear that your boys were kind of able to take one's experience and know kind of what types of questions to ask. And I think too, it brings up a good point that there are so many options, whether it be hearing aids, bone conduction devices, as we talked about. And I guess my question to all of you is, would you have preferred all of the options available at the time of your initial consultation, like everything from hearing aids to bone devices, just to show you the array of technologies that we have? Or is that something where you wanted the audiologist to just make the decision because they knew what was best for your child? I'm interested to hear what you guys kind of thought of that and that process.
This is Sarah. I would say, limit the choices to what the audiologist thinks is most appropriate, but then maybe at least so a parent knows there are choices that would be important to mention. I mean, some are not going to be appropriate. It's still challenging for folks going into cochlear implants to be told you can choose among these three and it's really up to you, unless the setting itself limits you to one or more choices. So I would love to have heard more of the audiologist's insight into what might work best. And maybe there isn't a best in that case.
I think as an audiologist, one of the challenges is there's all of these options. Some of them are prohibitive for degree of hearing loss.
Sure.
But if it's not brought up, how would you know? Do you know what I mean? Like sometimes a family will come back a year later and say, well, we saw this kind of hearing aid on this other kid. Why do you suppose, is that something we should be thinking about? So if time is available to at least give some materials that show all the types, and that way you've at least had the 30-second version of what's available. And Cassie, can you go back up to your picture of the types of hearing aids? One thing that is important to know is candidacy. In other words, what technology might best fit a certain kind of hearing loss has evolved pretty dramatically over the last 5 to 10 years. More than 10 years ago, we had digital evolution, and then we had features that allowed kids to get more power from hearing aids in other options besides a traditional behind the ear hearing aid. So the technology that evolved is the fact that feedback can be limited electronically somewhat now. And so a receiver in the canal might be appropriate for kids that only had the option of a behind the ear hearing aid 5 years ago because of the feedback issues. The other thing is they now make quite good ear molds or a modified ear mold for receiver in the canal hearing aids. And really that's pretty new. Over the past 5 years or so, they've done a much better job of making the type of ear molds that would be comfortable to use with a kid on the receiver in the canal. The acoustic advantage of the receiver in the canal, which is that little, you put your arrow on it, Cassie, the little speaker of the hearing aid is right there. And in the behind the ear hearing aid, the speaker of the hearing aid is up in the hard part. The acoustic advantage is with the speaker being closer to the canal, there likely is a better option for increased perhaps sound quality with high frequencies. Does kind of depend on the degree of hearing loss, but everything else being equal, especially for kids with mild, moderate, and even moderately severe hearing loss, a receiver in the canal might be a good option. Most audiologists would probably steer parents away from it as the first hearing aid in a baby. But up until maybe 5 years ago, we were steering kids away from it until they were almost adults. And I think you're seeing more and more audiologists feeling comfortable with receiver in the canal style with the modified ear molds on kids of most ages, with the hope that it gives them increased sound quality with the high frequency boost you might get with the speaker in the canal, and some of the other advantages that might be inherent to that style. In-the-ear hearing aids are rarely, if ever, fit on kids. And I'll go even further to say in-the-ear hearing aids are not fit very frequently even in adults these days. A receiver in the canal style hearing aid, I believe, is about 80% of the market for hearing aids. In-the-ear hearing aids, the problem with them is they're not big enough to hold some of the advanced signal processing things, and they plug up the ear. So with kids, we do have a problem of them outgrowing them, with them having a hard piece of plastic that could get a knock on the head. So there's all kinds of challenges with the in-the-ear hearing aid. So that's kind of the quick version of what an audiologist might have told you if they told you these options. Bone conduction hearing aids are for a very select population, and typically audiologists would not even bring that up as an option unless the child was a candidate. The candidates for bone conduction hearing aids are typically conductive hearing loss, possibly single-sided deafness. So those are very select populations for bone conduction. And then obviously cochlear implants are on the list, but I think we'll get to that. Does anyone have any questions about style or what you should ask the audiologist or what might work?
I'll ask a question, I guess. So what should we look at when we're approaching it? As far, we've kind of been all over the board. So at first we were kind of suggested to start with Oticon. From Oticon, when we upgraded next, they told us, well, try Phonak. And now they're telling us to look at the ad here. My son has low frequency, mild, moderate, conductive hearing loss. And so I feel like we're kind of all over the board on kind of where we're being steered. And I don't know maybe how to narrow down, I mean, question-wise, what is appropriate for him, just because we keep kind of moving in all different kinds of directions. But his hearing loss has been stable, that mild, moderate, low frequency conductive, since he was 8 at 2. So we're hanging 5 years at that loss.
Well, the quick version, and feel free to chime in here, Cassie, the quick version is there is no one best hearing aid manufacturer and there is no one best hearing aid model. That's true now almost more than ever. In the past, sometimes hearing aid companies would specialize in certain things, and so there were overly specialized things. Generally speaking, Oticon and Phonak are really the only manufacturers that try to be kid-friendly. So that's why you hear more about Oticon and Phonak when your kids are young, because they go out of their way to make sure they have a whole pediatric program. That doesn't mean that some of the other hearing aids might not work for a child. They might work very well, but on the other hand, Oticon and Phonak try to have tamper-proof battery doors and all of these other things to help families. So you'll probably hear that the most. What drives the decision is often features at this point, as opposed to what's the best hearing aid model. And when I say features, rather than say, do you want an Oticon or do you want a Phonak? You can say, well, what are the differences? What are the concrete differences? Okay. Do you want a light that flashes so you know that the battery works? Okay, there's a particular hearing aid that does that. Do you want direct to Bluetooth because your child is going to be, likes using the computer a lot, and so you don't want to have to mess with the streamer? Or maybe your child only has an iPhone. Some hearing aids only work with iPhones directly. They don't work with other kinds of devices. So features often drive the decision between which company, instead of which is best from a programming standpoint or a processing standpoint. So, and the other thing I would add is it's very important that the audiologists feel comfortable with the advanced programming options of the hearing aid model you are getting. So it is true that's a little bit individual audiologist motivated, because it's kind of like going to somebody who sells 5 kinds of computers. My guess is they feel most comfortable knowing all of the options on one of those models, because it's a lot of training to learn how to support one of those operating systems. If they were to be an expert in 5 different operating systems, they would spend half of their time in training. So hopefully the audiologists know enough about the different models so they feel comfortable being able to differentiate, but they probably do most of their work with probably a couple companies. And so you want to be sure that you go to the audiologist that can best support whatever it is you're getting. That's a really important part of the decision.
This is Brenda. I think the other part that drives things that as we get to the school age is making sure that whatever device you purchase for your child is a pull system, in the sense of most of the time they have, whether it's Roger or whatever remote devices they're using that are compatible with certain brands. And so, and that may be, it may be that for your kiddo, you know, that your brains don't work and you have to, kind of go outside the box for that. But that is something that is important to consider if you're going to be mainstream or having access to public school systems.
And I would say that is really important, but most hearing aids today can be compatible. Okay, 5 years ago, 10 years ago, 20 years ago, not always the case. But most hearing aids can be compatible. Now, that might mean a different type of hardware that you don't really want to use to connect you to the school system. And that would be good to know up front. Does it connect directly? Do I need to wear something? Do I need to plug something in? What is the challenge? But most hearing aids behind the ear or receiver in the canal can be adaptable with a streamer and a plug into the FM. So that's the good news.
That's great news, especially for this old mom.
Cassie, do you want to change direction a little bit with signal processing?
Yes. So another component that we don't often talk about in appointments is speech and noise processing. So the big questions we get, what is this? Why is it important? And why is it important for our patients' hearing aids to have this? So speech and noise processing, when I think about how difficult it is to hear in a noisy restaurant setting, how much effort it takes just with normal hearing to try and understand the person across the table from me. Now imagine the amount of cognitive effort and listening fatigue that children with hearing loss have in their day-to-day environments, whether it be the classroom, the playground, at home at dinner with a few siblings talking all at the same time. What we know is that can be a difficult listening environment for everyone involved. So the nice part of the newest hearing aids that are on the market is they have something called speech and noise processing that's automatically built into the hearing aid programming. What it is essentially is the hearing aids or the microphones on the hearing aids pick up the speech input from the child's environment and they categorize it as speech or noise. And automatically the hearing aid reduces the noise and increases the volume of the speech. And it is constantly doing this on a day-to-day basis. While your child is transitioning from their classroom to outside at the playground, it's analyzing the environment that they're in order to make sure that speech is amplified and noise is not. The great part is every hearing aid has this, and we as audiologists have the ability to manipulate it further. If, say, your child is struggling even with the speech and noise processing they have, we can make it stronger or we can make it less effective depending upon the environment. But the big thing I want to talk about here and why it's so important is because it's automatic in all of your kiddos' newer hearing aids, which is a major, major thing for families. And it's just comforting to know that your child won't have to be pressing any buttons, switching between programs to have that be effective. Now, prior to me talking about it, had anyone heard of speech and noise processing before? Okay, that's good. I like that. I like that there are hands. I know a few of you have older kiddos. Do your kiddos notice a difference between their old hearing aids to their newer hearing aids? How much better speech is in loud, noisier environments? Okay, that's good to hear. Does anyone have like a personal story they want to share or anything?
It's not necessarily about speech and noise, but my youngest, he both times when he's gotten new hearing aids, these last time, he's like, oh, my voice sounds even cooler than I thought it did. So it's just one of those things, as a young, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12-year-old, but it's neat to hear that he can tell differences. We just went through this 2 days ago, the new Marvel hearing aid that he had stopped charging. We found a way to do a hard reset. So he'd been going around 2 days kind of almost as a unilateral kid, and it was driving him crazy. And his old hearing aids didn't function well enough to. So we used them today, and he's like, oh, this is so loud, but again, just that adjustment where it's neat, again, for me to hear him just vocalize about how he notices the difference. And he wears his aids all the time. He always wants to hear. The older one really likes to have auditory breaks unless he's, working or, around other people, and just two different people.
Brenda, one thing that you brought up last time about music is kind of relevant here too, because Speech and noise processing can reduce what the hearing aid thinks is non-speech sounds. And so for kids, especially musically inclined kids, they can sometimes be limited in their music appreciation or the ability to hear the broad frequency and not have low frequencies limited. Almost all hearing aids have the ability now to put in a music program. Sometimes it happens automatically, but I think for kids that are musically inclined, if they don't mind changing the program to music, I think they would hear a difference. And I think you shared that last time with us.
Right, yeah, he definitely, by then he was in 8th grade and he was just pleased, astonished, and that's still his favorite program he uses as he feels it's more natural, unless like we are in a restaurant or something.
The other thing about speech and noise processing is the hearing aids work together to process speech around the noise. So if you have a unilateral hearing aid, it doesn't necessarily take advantage of all of these advanced signal processing, and you probably don't need to buy the expensive signal processing hearing aid because it's not, because you have one open ear, it's not able to reduce the noise effectively anyway. And the other thing about the processing in the hearing aid, all those styles we showed you, within one type of hearing aid, for example, a Phonak Marvel, there's a 30 version, a 50 version, a 70 version, a 90 version. They all look the same, but the signal processing, especially speech and noise, gets more advanced the higher the number and is more expensive. So you can't tell by looking at it, and it's good to have that discussion and let your audiologist know what kind of environments are you hoping your child gets optimized by the signal processing of the hearing aid. That's really the decision between basic and advanced and everything in between.
Perfect. Thank you for sharing, Sandy. So we're going to move on to the next slide. So there are a few other features that we talk about, and I'm wondering, just from your personal experience with your kiddos, has Bluetooth streaming been helpful, FM, indicator lights, or app control? What have they noticed is a big push for them in accepting and using their devices more?
This is Sarah Crick. He actually switched from Phonak to a Resound because he was wanting to connect with his phone, and that's been huge. He uses it all the time. He was having trouble having phone conversations, and it's been great for connecting to the distance learning as well as just phone conversations. And the thing I find the hardest is I don't know when he's plugged in. So you have a conversation, he pretends like he's answering you, and then you realize he's listening to music. So that's been our struggle, but it was a good change. And I know Phonak now, I think, has gotten some of that technology, but that's why we had switched from the Phonak to the Resound at that time, which was 3 years ago, I believe.
Thank you for sharing. And yes, that's a good point. I think Resound isn't often talked about in the very beginning, but it is something I found a lot of my older kids really like to wear. Even prior to Phonak coming out with their streaming capabilities, Resound was also another type of manufacturer that we do work with. And you cannot say it any differently, because honestly, all kids now love to stream, and that's a big thing. And I think parents' biggest struggle with that is, when are they on and when are they off? So it's a growing process, but I think from our perspective as an audiologist, I'm okay with it because they're wearing their devices. But yes, it's hard to tell when they're paying attention to you and when they're not, for sure.
I had another question that I just kind of wanted to put out there, because Sarah started to bring this up in regards to cochlear implants and how you're given all three and they're just sort of put in front of you to make that decision. Sorry for the barking. But I just was kind of curious in a thought process, if anyone has some experience, what was it that made you maybe choose a specific implant company? Was it because of the features? Was it because of maybe the hearing aid company that they were partnered with? What kind of made that decision, or was the driving thing for you?
This is Sarah. I will jump in. I think there's only one other implant user in the group right now. We talked to all 3 manufacturers and people who use them. And I think the deciding factor for us at the time, you know, once you decide you belong to that company, so you can't choose afterwards, was the internal capability and the cost of repair and replacement, which I rarely see people talk about, but there was a big difference at the time when we had to make that choice. But it was a tough one. And then I think definitely weighed into it what our audiologist was familiar working with too. Anybody else want to jump in?
In terms of the Bluetooth, my son is loving that streaming, and we haven't really explored the app because he doesn't have a phone. So we haven't really messed with that yet. He is longing for the day when he can adjust his own volume. I guess because he's just never had that capability. And the lights, the only thing we use them for is when they're charging or not. So we haven't done the blinking lights, mostly because he was older and just didn't see. He does know, he can tell when things sound dark or when he needs to recharge them. And at 12, I mean, he's very self-sufficient with that.
Thank you.
So do you have a slide on FM?
In the very beginning, let's see. We talked about FM, just a recap of last week. It's not a huge breakdown of FM.
Let me just respond a little to the question and a little bit about FM in general. As Brenda mentioned, FM or Roger is used in the classrooms for most kids with hearing loss. So you're all probably familiar with the concept of remote transmission. And the idea is you're connecting your kid's ear to the location of basically the remote microphone. And so the question is, I think, when would you want to use it? And in the case of unilateral hearing loss, would it be helpful to put it on the good ear? And I would say every one of us would benefit from FM in situations. There's no question. Typical hearing people with hearing challenges, people with just challenges in auditory processing, in some situations, there's no question that all of us would benefit. And so we have to kind of think about that. This isn't a technology where we're weighing whether there could be an environment that would be beneficial. There absolutely could. It's whether what the goals are for your child, how invested are you in the hardware, and doing things that might take more effort to learn how to use the hardware, to ask the teacher to wear the microphone. But remote listening from a distance, and listening in the presence of background noise would be enhanced for all of us if we had, even in our normal hearing ear, a speaker that was connected to a remote microphone. So if you think about it like that, then you just kind of think about, okay, what are the environments that are important to my child, that are important to the learning environment, that are important to our home environment, that would help make listening easier. And if listening in noise, listening from a remote site is challenging in any way, it could be helped by an FM system. So then you kind of have to decide, okay, what does that look like? What's the best way to connect it to my child? If my child has typical hearing, you would have to use something like a focus thing that sits in the ear. If your child uses any type of hearing technology, personal hearing technology, hearing aid, cochlear implants, there's a way to connect it. There's no question. And there are so many options that it starts getting so mind-boggling. Sometimes parents just say, okay, whatever. I don't have I'm not an IT professional. But they are much easier to use than those of you with teenagers or older remember. I've been an audiologist long enough to know FM systems have been, in the past, very challenging because there's all kinds of ways to lose your connection, or the plug-in goes bad, the speaker goes bad, the charging goes bad, the distance goes bad, you're on the wrong channel, those are the main things that kept us from being more proactive. Many of those things are much, much simpler now. And I personally am a big proponent to consider the use of FM or Roger at home, help transition your kids into benefiting from it as an adult. But I also know we have to be realistic. It's very common where kids go through times when it's not beneficial enough for them to want to do it. And I get that, but that doesn't mean you can't revisit it another time, like Sarah's story last week about her daughter re-embracing the technology when she was older. So I think it should always be part of what you talk to the audiologist about when you're choosing technology upgrades for your children, whether they're 5, 10, 15, 20, 25, because how does it work with an FM system should always be at least something that's on the list of considerations, even though it may not be the top.
I have a question about like backward compatibility, I guess. Like with the last pair of Phonex we had, we got a mini mic. It was a, you know, like, and they were the Phonex guy, whatever Q they were then, and now they're, you know, another level. But, and I guess this might be more a question specifically for our audiologists, but is it, do the companies kind of try to work, because, you know, as parents, when we put out for a streaming device and then we put out for a mini mic, so far none of my kids have really embraced those other than for their FM at school, like with the streaming, the mini mic at home or in the car. They've just been like, yeah, no. And so we've respected that. But I just got to thinking as I saw one in the closet when I was looking for a backup hearing aid, is there backward compatibility, do you know?
The answer is sometimes. So streamers, which are things that are the intermediary device, and some of the clips are streamers. In other words, some of the clips work by streaming as opposed to Bluetooth. Most of the newer hearing aids are going to get away from streaming. So the Phonak Marble, you can't stream to a Phonak Marble. So if you have a streaming mic, it won't work. Okay. But if you have a Bluetooth mic, Bluetooth can Bluetooth. It can Bluetooth to anything. It doesn't even have to be a Phonak product.
Right, okay.
Now, the other companies do not have universal Bluetooth yet. Phonak was the first. I'm sure they'll all catch up, meaning to Bluetooth to a resound device, if you don't have an iPhone, you would still need a streamer. So there still are, streamers are still in our vocabulary, and streamers aren't as backwards compatible as Bluetooth or FM.
That makes perfect sense. Thank you.
Just to add on to that a little bit, I think it relates to the Roger receivers. Like if we're talking specifically about Phonak, if you look at your receiver, you can ask your audiologist depending on the actual serial number. I can't remember it off the top of my head what it is, but there are certain ones on that are still compatible with newer Roger technology, but it's just sort of dependent on when it came out.
In other words, you need an AUD degree to figure it out sometimes.
Yes, and I would say now that technology is expanding as rapidly as it is, it's very hard from our perspective as well to keep up. So we try and do that as much as we can, but sometimes the Bluetooth can be just as confusing when you've got multiple devices. So it's always helpful to ask questions. And if you want a written out, typed out guide on how to pair if it's working, just ask us, because I know from my perspective, I like to do that for all of the devices that I pair for my kiddos' hearing aids, just so I have a resource. And I know any of us would be happy to print that out and give it to families just as a quick refresh of how Bluetooth works and if it's streaming, just because it can be confusing at times. But I know we're running a little low on time. I think we might already be past the mark. So I just have one more slide I wanted to show you guys. So we talked about speech and noise processing. We talked about some favorite features. These are some of the bimodal options for cochlear implants. So Cochlear works with Resound hearing aids. AB works with Phonak, and Medal right now it works with some things, but not specifically manufacturer. So all in all, I just wanted to kind of bring it as a whole to the discussion. Did you guys have any questions about newer technology, anything that we talked on that was confusing, or any points of clarification that you would like from today's talk?
This is Sarah. I just wondered about your opinion about upgrading just by the age of the current hearing aids. Is there a guideline that you go by? I know our insurance mandate is 5 years or a hearing change, and wondered if you had other insights.
Personally, I was the extern at Children's Colorado. We go by 5 years, but if my kiddo, by insurance perspectives, is eligible before 5 years, and they're coming about that 7, 8, 9 age, and they're in older technology where they can't stream, personally, I like to bring up the options that are available now, no, and saying to the family, this is an option, but we don't have to do it right now. But also keeping in mind that if I bring up the possibility of Bluetooth streaming to a 9-year-old, it might be very hard to get that idea out of their head. So always having those talks with parents and the patients about, hey, this technology is available, just kind of like we mentioned, so they're not blindsided to what's on the market, but knowing that you're due for an upgrade in a few years, we can talk, or in a year, we can talk about it more then, or we can talk about it today. I don't know if Annalise, you kind of go by something differently, or Sandy.
The comment that I have is some insurance companies will cover them every 3 years. And if you think now of hearing aid technology similar to computer technology or telephone technology, in other words, 3 years, things can change a lot. Certainly in 5 years. That doesn't necessarily mean that your child has to have the streaming, but if you kind of think about, are you one of those people that still has your iPhone 5? Or did you really feel like you needed the newer iPhone to maximize your options? And that's kind of a lot how hearing technology is these days. Typically speaking, every manufacturer comes out with a platform upgrade about every 3 years. And about every year they come out with software changes. So just to give you an idea, if you replace hearing aids every 5 or 6 years, which is common, you might be 2 generations behind a big platform change like direct to Bluetooth or digital signal processing. That's not necessarily terrible, but it kind of depends on what your personal needs are and how your child is doing and whether you can convince the insurance it's worth upgrading.
Right.
For those,
Go ahead, Brenda.
for those who are in the 5-year circle, do you guys ever recommend like sending them in before the warranty is over to get refurbished? Is that a regular part of your procedure, or
I always do that. Like, I recommend that to every patient, no matter if it's a kid or an adult, to send it in just before the warranty is over, just, to get that refresh. Because I know sometimes too, warranties and how long they last, whether it's 3 or 5 years, or even other companies can be different. That can be a thing too. So no, I always recommend that.
And I would say, especially if you're using rechargeable devices, because they will upgrade the internal battery when you send it in during the warranty period. And they say the batteries can last 5 years, but if you send it in at 3 years or shy of 3 years, they'll put a new battery in and then you have a longer battery life.
Great. Thank you.
Did anyone else have any other questions?
I had a question. Sorry, this is Renee. I'm Katrina's mom. But for that refurbish, what does that go under? It just is a refurbish coding on that for when you send it in?
It's a hearing aid warranty check.
It's a warranty check, okay. And my other question was, with all of this going on now, do you think it's going to lead to more remote programming for the
It already has.
It has, and
It
will
has.
it continue to?
Before all of this, I would say most audiologists were using remote programming primarily on adults. And with all of this going on, for example, Oticon introduced their remote programming option just while we're in quarantine. Phonak Resound had it before, and I'm not sure about Widex, but the idea would be we don't want to do all the program remotely because then we're going to miss being able to measure the changes in the ear canal. But small things, absolutely, remote programming is very helpful. You do need to put an app on your phone, most likely, to be able to connect to the audiologist connect the hearing aids to the app and connect the app through your phone to the audiologist. But absolutely, I think that'll be more and more prevalent.
Okay, thank you.
This is Sarah. I wanted to add that sometimes timing is also important. If a child is being served by Medicaid, they don't cover hearing aids after age 21, right? And TRICARE, active military does cover hearing aids, but not the retired benefit if someone's doing a change of service for dependents.
And I also
Important thing.
Oops, sorry, Sandy. No, you can
Just
go.
a real last thought that made me think that Voc Rehab will cover hearing aids and associated devices to cochlear implants and hearing aids beginning in the teenage years, officially by 16, but sometimes even younger. So if you need compatible devices covered, or if there's a lapse in insurance, VR is a good option.
But start early. My gosh.
VR can be, I would say one of the barriers of VR is the process.
Yeah.
If you can endure the process, it's worth it in the end. Great, I think we are finished. Thank you, everybody. Thank you, Cassie. Thank you, Sarah. Next week is the last one we have scheduled, and it'll be on troubleshooting and kind of taking care of your devices, and Annalise is gonna lead us. So we hope to see all of you, and if you want to think of questions in advance, we'll be ready for you.
Right. And as you said, it's open mic days too, so if people have other questions, feel free. Thanks so much.
Thank you.
Have a good afternoon.
I have a
Thank you.
question. When will it be available on YouTube, you think? Not until the whole series is complete?
Well, we have 2 of them up. They're just, YouTube hasn't approved them. And that takes a process. And if YouTube approves them, and if they're not too long, they actually will caption them for us. So we have that request in right now. I just don't know how long it will take.
Okay. All right. Wait to hear.
Great.
Sarah will put out something, right, Sarah?
I will. Thank you.
Link or something. All right. Thank you.
All right. Have a good afternoon.